The importance of women's slave narratives. Many of us, most likely through our education, have experienced a slave narrative of the 19th century and gained insight into what it was like to have been an enslaved African American. There are many popular forms of media that capture this, such as Frederick Douglass's autobiographies or even the popular movie 12 Years a Slave, based on the memoirs of Solomon Northup. However, these pieces of media exclude the perspective of a large group of people who also suffered through slavery, African American women. While all slave narratives have immense value in remembering what slavery was and how it impacted our nation and those who live in it, I want to take the time today to explain why women's slave narratives are so important to not only our past, but our present as well. Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, Harriet Beecher Stowe was born on June 14th in 1811 and died on July 1st, 1896. She was an American author and advocate for women's and some African American rights, with her most important work being the fictional novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was in 1951 when the story was published, about 10 years before the start of the Civil War, and it followed the plausible story of a young enslaved woman and her child attempting to avoid being recaptured by their master. The reason that this story was problematic was due to the fact that Stowe herself was a white woman writing about a group of people she does not belong to, and had little personal experience with. However, Stowe did receive the rarity of a formal education as a woman and used the currently topical issue of slavery to attempt to promote women's rights over those of African American rights. While she did want to abolish slavery, she was really using her story to attempt to get white women more rights instead, proving that she was intellectual and other women are capable of that as well. So the impact of Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was after the fictitious Uncle Tom's Cabin had been published that more and more nonfiction and fictional accounts of slavery had started to become published as well. But they were unfortunately used by both sides of the Civil War as propaganda. The southern states began to even attempt writing anti-Tom novels, which tried to justify slavery, saying that slaves were happy as slaves. This evidently created a lot of rising tensions in the United States, though it was only a small factor in what caused the war to break out. Fortunately, Stowe was one of the few female American authors who was able to become famous enough at the time to prove that women were capable of writing emotionally and intellectually captivating stories. Unfortunately, she did not capitalize on the opportunity to be able to push further for African Americans' rights as well. So Harriet Jacobs and the Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Harriet Jacobs was born into slavery, most likely sometime in 1813, and died on March 7, 1897, as a successful author, abolitionist, and a free woman. Her most famous work is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which tells her true story of being born into slavery, sexually abused, and eventually working to freedom by hiding in a crawlspace for 7 years to avoid being separated from her family. While there were many similar stories being published at this time, the reason that it was problematic was due to the fact that there was discussions about the sexual abuse of Jacobs and possibly other enslaved women, which was also a very taboo topic at the time. Jacob struggled to find a publisher who would accept her story without them not believing her or turning it down due to the sexual abuse sections, even after all the names in the story were changed. It wasn't until 1861, almost 10 years after she wrote it, that it got published. So then the impact of Jacobs and her story. While sexual abuse was not uncommon between a slave master and their slaves, it unfortunately was rarely acknowledged by the public, which made Jacob struggle for years after becoming a free woman to ever tell anyone. This was an extremely risky thing to put into a story at that time, and there are letters from Jacobs expressing how much she feared a public backlash against her. But it ultimately opened the door to many similar stories being published and the public actually talking about it. There are also records of Jacobs actually asking Stowe for her help on the story, but unfortunately Stowe responded with a racist remark, and Jacobs stopped pursuing Stowe's help. On the other hand, Jacobs did gain a lot of respect from the public for both publishing a non-fictional account and acknowledging one of the darker parts of slavery. I mean, obviously all of it is dark, but sexual abuse was rarely acknowledged. And this made the support for getting women's rights and abolishing slavery higher in the public yet again. summarize, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a fictional story about slavery that gained the support of the public for how well it captured the humanity and struggle of an African American woman and her child in slavery. While this did support empowering women and push for women's rights, it really only used the issues of slavery as a stepping stone for more women's rights, ignoring the possibility of African American rights as well. Harriet Jacobs also focused more on pushing for more women's rights by acknowledging the sexual abuse found within the institutions of slavery. But she also gave credibility to African Americans by recounting her true, uncut story to the public. Both Stowe and Jacobs wrote stories that pushed for more rights for both women and African Americans, whether those were their initial intentions or not, and this pushed the public to actually strive to improve the conditions and rights for both. Ultimately, all slave narratives are important to our history and culture, regardless of who the author in question might be. Neither gender or race change that fact, despite them having different values and purposes. However, it is worth noting that some of the first slave narratives written by women had helped the first stirrings of rights for women and African Americans in the United States begin to turn into large movements. Without the writings of Stowe and Jacobs and their large influences over American culture and beliefs, there's no telling where a nation would be when it comes to civil rights.